So I'm Stephanie Flanders, Head of Government and Economics at Bloomberg, and welcome to Trumponomics, the podcast that looks at the economic world of Donald Trump, how he's already shaped the global economy, and what on earth is going to happen next. And this week, we're recording Trumponomics in front of an audience who seem very alive, from Bloomberg Invest Hong Kong. And we're looking at what Trumponomics means for this part of Asia, notably mainland China and Hong Kong. And overnight, we've seen the latest round of trade talks in London between the US and China conclude with what our Bloomberg geoeconomics analyst Michael Deng has called a tactical de-escalation, but not a strategic reset. So we're none the wiser on where tariff rates will end up, or how deep the much-discussed decoupling of the world's two largest economies will go. But we have plenty to discuss, and I'm sure plenty of theories on these two sofas here as to what direction we're going about all of that, and maybe also the future of the dollar. I have some great guests to help me talk this through. As I mentioned, my colleague Rebecca Chong-Wilkins, Asia Economics and Government Reporter for us at Bloomberg, Hao Hong, Managing Partner and Chief Investment Officer at Lotus Asset Management, and Robin Ching, from the Chief China Economist at Morgan Stanley. Now, Rebecca, maybe I'll take advantage of you as the reporter in the room. Just take us up to speed on how you're reading that statement we had out of London last night, and I think we're still expecting a statement from the Chinese about those talks as well.
Yes, I mean, not a lot of detail, in fact, from both sides. Largely all of the detail coming from the US side here, but more than 20 hours of negotiations over 2 days, both the sort of heavy hitters from the US and the China side. Essentially, we are back to, I think, that point in the Geneva truce where both sides were sitting down saying, yeah, maybe something can happen, maybe we can do a deal. We're going back to that pause. But it's important to understand why there was that sort of breakdown in the Geneva truce in the first place. And it really fundamentally is over this issue of rare earths. China introduced restrictions on 7 different rare earths. These were global restrictions, essentially requiring licenses from companies all over the world now, not just US. But in addition, there was effectively a shadow ban on US requiring these licenses. Now, as part of the Geneva truce, a really critical part of that truce was this agreement that the Chinese side would effectively lift that shadow ban and allow licenses. Now, the whole disagreement and the reason why we saw this breakdown between the US and China side is precisely what that meant. What does it actually mean for Beijing to expedite these licenses? How quickly is that going to come through? On the China side, of course, we are talking about an entirely new system of export controls over 7 different substances. It's a global program. It's deeply complex, 45 days of a review process, etc. And it does seem on the US side that there was an expectation that once that Geneva agreement was made, that there would be a much more rapid introduction and implementation. So that's really at the crux, it seems, of where there was this sort of breakdown in relationships between the US and China. So now it seems, I say that very tentatively because we don't have a lot of details, but it seems like there is a quote-unquote framework to allow this expedited process or allow these rare earths to continue being exported into the US. We do not have any details on what that might mean, and both sides still do need to go back to their respective leaders and effectively run this by, their bosses.
But on the other side, there had been some sort of excitement in the last couple of days when the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, actually mentioned export controls and was also apparently thinking about some of the US export controls on China, which have been a very sore point for the Chinese. Do we have any clarity on which of those controls were discussed? Because some are much more important than others.
Absolutely. So sort of yes and no here. So we think that some of the immediate retaliatory export controls that the US rolled out when they believe that the Chinese side were not living up to their expectations and the agreement on rare earths, will be lifted. So that includes restrictions on things like domestic technology for software technology for developing semiconductors, nuclear materials, chemicals, some jet engine parts. So these are the latest package of retaliatory measures that we've seen coming out of the US since that breakdown in the Geneva Truce. It's unclear if this will involve some of these more fundamental issues over export controls over semiconductors. That, of course, is the big sticking point, these restrictions that were rolled out under Biden and continue to be expanded. So part of the small yard, high fence range of measures.
Okay, well, Robin Singh, you don't have to, of course, Rebecca has to stick to absolutely what she knows, but you get to just... speculate wildly on the basis of very serious economic analysis. How are you reading where we've got to? And I guess, what will you be looking for in terms of the sort of economic impact of these ongoing talks on China right today?
Thank you, Stephanie. I like the word you used, speculating, given all this flip-flop about trade talks. So far, the bid-ask gap between US and China is still very wide. If you look at the readouts from the US side, they are later focusing on trade deal, on upcoming logistics for rare earths, as Rebecca, you elaborated. But the Chinese version, Beijing's readout, covered a much bigger picture. They want to reset the grand relationship between US and China, covering tech curbs, student visa, geopolitical issues. So apparently, Beijing wanted a grand bargaining deal. So I think there is a huge gap between the bid-ask, and that means the ongoing talks won't be easy. Maybe they can extend this trade tariff detente, but what Beijing wanted is beyond tariffs. And Rebecca, you mentioned the rare earth. Now China is using it more like a strategic card because of the tech curbs. So what you said is like Beijing's thinking, if you cut our chips, I will cut your magnets. And over the last 7 years, since the first trade war in 2018, China has strengthened its dominance in key supply chains like rare earth. Today, they control more than 80% of rare earth refining capacity, more than 90% of the magnet production, which is widely used in next generation of tech and the supply chain, including EV cars, humanoid robotics, even modern defense system. So now China is using that in exchange for potential relaxation of tech curbs. That's also part of Beijing's strategic play, sending a message to US allies, making them think twice about aligning too closely to the tech curbs on China. So I do think all of this showed China wanted a grand bargaining deal covering not just the tariff, but the tech and geopolitical issues. Given that's not going to be easy, you may see continued uncertainty on trade talks. So our base case is by end of this year, the US terminal tariff rate on China will probably stay similar to today's level, 30%, 40%, given all these difficulties and the divergence of Beijing and Washington's readouts. And that's going to cost the foreign firms margins, cost the Chinese exporters jobs. So it's still a downside risk to the economy.
Hao Hong, I guess I'm struck by, it feels like the US side had not fully grasped how reliant key parts of the US supply chain was on these rare earths. And I'm kind of reminded of the depiction someone had of the ongoing debate, which is the US has decided they absolutely want a divorce from China in 10 years' time, but live together in the interim for the entire 10 years. That is the challenge that you see in some of these talks.
Yeah, well, I think it's similar to a couple fighting through a divorce process, right? So the two parties don't see each other in the future, but then at the same time, they still have to live with the consequence and how to divide up the assets. I think, just now, Rebecca and Robin mentioned about the rare earth, and also at the opening, you mentioned about the progress at the London talk isn't as smooth as it should be. It is because, the counteroffer from the US part is probably too low, too sort of not good enough for China. All right, so I think as a result, even though China has agreed to sort of restart the approval process for rare earth exports at the Geneva session, the Chinese can always run a slower than expected process to approve it, right? So normally it takes probably 1 to 2 weeks to approve to get a permit for exports, and now it takes 2 months, right? Then that way, on the surface, on paper, China is not violating the agreement, but then at the same time, you're still not getting your key ingredient for your GPUs. So I think China can do a lot of these things to slow down the process, and also at the same time, people have to recognize the situation that in the U.S., I think the American consumers probably can't live for much longer at the higher prospect of much substantially higher inflation. And then at the same time, because of the process of this trade war and how this trade war started, it actually somehow united the Chinese people together. Right. So if you're in mainland China, you can really feel the atmosphere, and also rooting for China in this negotiation process. So I think the Chinese people is very famous for eat bitter, right? So in the Chinese culture, eat bitter means you can endure substantial hardship for a very long time. So as a result, as you can see, this group of people is ready to fight. But then at the same time, the American consumers really want to get cheap goods. So then that way you can see, the China can afford to wait while the Americans probably can't. And so I think it's setting a stage for the negotiation. So I think one shouldn't be too surprised that, as China jack on, then the Americans would have to give more concession during the process. And then towards the end, we probably get a result that is more favorable than expected for the Chinese people.
And just to follow up on that, I mean, if I noticed, the World Bank's obviously brought out some new forecasts this week, and I think it's cut the growth forecast for 70% of the world's economies, almost all of the world's biggest economies. It's halved this year's forecast for the US. The only country that it hasn't cut the forecast for this year and next is China. So I guess, just to come back to you, Hao Hong, is China, at this point, is China winning the trade war? Is China coming out of this certainly much better than the US?
Yeah, well, I think it's much better than the trade war phase 1 in 2018, right? So I think, during the current trade war, China is more prepared than before, and also China is ready to use the asymmetric retaliation towards the U.S. counterpart. So I think as a result, on the surface, the Chinese growth is steady, Chinese exports is steady, and if you look at the Chinese domestic economy, you're seeing, two parts of the economy. One part is export manufacturing driven, that is doing really well. So even though the exports to the U.S. has been down like 1/3, but then to the rest of the world is really booming. And then at the same time, if you want to bearish on the Chinese economy, you can look at the consumer sector, right, which is way below expectation and is still not recovering. And then if you look at the housing sector, the housing bubble bursting process is still dragging on. So depending on which part of the Chinese economy you look at, and then you can draw very different conclusions.
And it is interesting, Rebecca. I mean, we have debates in Bloomberg and with the economists as well, because we'll have analysis of the sort of long-term, obviously, the growth trajectory being lower for China and what that means in terms of people's expectations after years of double-digit growth. But alongside that sort of pessimism around China, the Chinese economy, we'll also be reading the latest release of the breakthrough with DeepSeek, or the latest incredible charging technology for electric cars, where China seems to be powering ahead much faster than people expected. So, how do you sort of deal with that schizophrenia day to day when people are asking you, how's the China economy?
Well, I think to Hao Hong's point, to a certain extent, it really depends where you look. And clearly there are areas where we've had, most notably high quality manufacturing, where enormous amounts of investment have been pouring in. And you do see the clear emergence of winners among Chinese firms. Think about electric cars, think about DeepSeek, AI. These are investments that have been going in for the last decade or so. We can think about the China 2025 plans, for example. By and large, aside from semiconductors, China has met all of its aspirations in becoming either a global leader or one of a global leader in those key sectors. So in some ways, China is meeting its own tests. But on the other hand, to Hao Hong's point, there is still this quite painful transformation that is being ushered away from a debt-driven, property investment-led society, and that clearly does still provide drags on the economy. I know at Morgan Stanley that you have your own sort of social metric index of content in China, if that's one way to put it. But another way is when you kind of look, for example, at private data sets at protests in China. Now, they're relatively small scale. We're talking about in the hundreds. But by and large, we have seen those continue to climb, particularly over the course of this year. They tend to be very economic focused. These are economic issues. They're rarely political, in fact, actually. They're often around housing issues. They're often around unpaid wages. So to that point of knowing sort of where to look, is you can see these pockets of real tension, particularly at the local government level where finances are really strained. And then overall, when we think about the consumer mood, of course, most consumer indexes will still show that we are pretty far from where we were pre-pandemic as well. So overall, that mood is different. But to Hao Hong's point, I will say there has been a remarkable transformation in how this is all viewed as a result of the trade war. When we think about last year, there were all of these stories about deflation that Robin wrote extensively about, concerns about the property market, when we're going to see a bottom, and really the cost for ordinary people of President Xi Jinping's push to transform the economy. Was this really going to pay off? The end of the boom years. So with these sort of quite existential questions we are asking, now we are seeing this extraordinary support from many parts of the economy for President Xi, backing China, standing up, and this sort of resurgence of sort of a nationalism and a nationalist feeling and patriotic feeling as well. So, in some ways that's nothing to do with the Chinese economy. We're talking about the sort of enemy that the US has created for itself. That has changed the national mood in China, I think.
Well, Robin, I think we've established that Rebecca is a very careful reader of your work, but I'm interested in how you see that, and I think also, do we see out of this? We see maybe a change in the mood supporting the leadership, but have we also seen a change of direction from the leadership in terms of its commitment to rebalancing the economy, or is that just wishful thinking on the part of the Americans? A commitment from the top to a more consumption-led economy, which is, of course, what economists have been lecturing the Chinese about for many years.
Well, Stephanie, I think, Rebecca, you are spot on about the change of narrative.
Of course, because she's been reading your...
No.
I have been bothering him for many months, it's true.
She noticed the rise and the decline of readership of my deflation reports. Last year, it was all dominated by deflation, housing adjustment, overcapacity. Then suddenly, as Rebecca, you mentioned, there is a changing narrative, and how you also briefly touched it. At least right now, despite China is not in a sustainable recovery path yet, at least there is a bifurcation of the narrative, a tale of two economies. You have a very dynamic tech economy. Every other week you heard a new technology progress, either AI model or next generation of batteries or self-driving cars, or even recently China's healthcare biotech had its own DeepSeek moment, able to make fast follower drugs at competitive quality at a fraction of the US cost. So all of these are showing a very dynamic tech economy that helped Hong Kong. I think your Hong Kong conference today is becoming bigger, partially because Hong Kong is back with the ecosystem, private equity invested in tech, using Hong Kong as exit channel, creating new money. That animal spirit is largely back. But once you take off your augmented reality glass, you look at conventional consumers, as Hao mentioned, or housing, construction, they are pretty much stuck with deflation. And as economists, we have to explain why this bifurcation happened. I think fundamentally, China has not shifted from a supply-centric business model or policy approach towards consumption-centric. They did some baby steps, social welfare or consumer trade-in, but these are too little. Fundamentally, the local government incentives, the GDP KPI, the government revenue largely relying on VAT, which is linked to production, All of these are showing path dependency. They are still pretty much in supply-centric mentality. And I think, Rebecca, your colleague covered the debate about the next 5-year plan in an excellent way. We proposed that they should upgrade their Made in China 2025 to something called an open China market 2030, focusing on boosting domestic demand and consumption in a sustainable way, providing deeper social safety net, that social welfare, household-centric reform to unlock China's consumption potential. However, according to Bloomberg, they are probably still debating on doubling down on tech and the supply side in the next 5-year plan. So I do think that's the reason of the bifurcation of the economy, a tale of two economies. Unfortunately, for a bigger part of the macro economy, they are still stuck with deflation. So volume growth is fine. Stephanie, you mentioned many people maintained or upgraded their China forecast to 4.5% or higher for this year. But that's for real GDP, that's for volume. Once you look at the value or nominal side, we think China's nominal GDP growth will stay at a subdued level of 3.5% throughout maybe the end of next year, given the deflation problem. And the recent example of they did some interesting introduction of self-driving cars. But meanwhile, you see all these cutthroat pricing war during EV car, among all these EV car firms. So that's a perfect example of this supply versus demand imbalance is quite persistent in China.
And just to unpack a little bit for those who, for people listening who are not always listening to the sort of economist debates about this, when you talk about the rebalancing and when you talk about still focus on supply and some of the incentives, I mean, it's an economy that is geared around an extraordinarily high level of investment over many, many years and much lower consumption than you see in most economies, certainly developed, advanced economies, but also economies of a similar income. And the local, what you were saying, Robin, is that the local government officials are incentivized still around just pushing out output rather than getting income to households or providing welfare services. How, just for your perspective, I know when we discussed this before the session, you made the point that this was about not just rebalancing the Chinese economy, but also the US economy. I'm not sure that's the way the US sees that, but just explain that briefly to us.
Yeah. Well, I think,